My friends, I want to begin today with a confession that took me most of my life to admit out loud. When I was in my 60s, I believed I had already become the person I was meant to be. I believed the habits I had carried for decades were simply part of my character, fixed and unchangeable, the way the color of your eyes cannot be changed no matter how much you wish for a different shade. I told myself, this is simply who I am, and anyone who loves me should accept me exactly as I have always been. It felt, at the time, like a kind of self-respect. Looking back now, I understand it was something closer to fear dressed up as certainty. It was only in the years just before I turned 70 that I was forced, quite painfully, to look honestly at several habits I had been carrying since I was a young man. Some of these habits had once served me well, protecting me during difficult chapters of my life when I did not yet have better tools available. But by the time I reached my late 60s, these same habits were no longer protecting me. They were quietly costing me relationships, peace, and the kind of ease I had always assumed would simply arrive naturally with age. I watched friends my age who had let go of similar habits years earlier, and I watched the difference in how they carried themselves, how they loved and were loved, how they slept at night. And I watched other friends who, like me, had never released these habits, and I watched the slow, quiet toll it took on them as the years passed. I do not share what follows today to frighten you, and I do not share it from a place of judgment, because I lived every single one of these habits myself for far too long. I share it because I wish, more than almost anything else in my life, that someone had sat me down in my 50s or early 60s and told me plainly what I am about to tell you. 70 is not a wall. It is not a deadline that ends your ability to change. But I have noticed, both in myself and in every person I have watched grow old around me, that habits carried past 70 tend to calcify. They become harder to release with each passing year, not because change becomes impossible, but because the years of practice behind them grow heavier and harder to set down. If you are watching this before you reach 70, consider this a gift I did not receive in time for myself. If you are already past 70, I promise you it is still not too late. I began releasing some of these very habits in my own 70s, and the peace it brought me arrived just as fully, simply a little later than I wish it had. Let us walk through these 6 habits together, honestly and without flinching, because I believe the honesty itself is where the real freedom begins. For most of my adult life, I carried grudges the way other people carry family heirlooms, polishing them occasionally, taking them out to examine them during quiet moments, keeping them safe in a drawer of my mind reserved specifically for old wounds. I had a grudge against a business partner who had wronged me in my 40s. I had a grudge against a cousin who had said something unkind at a family funeral decades earlier. I had a grudge against my own brother over an inheritance dispute that technically resolved itself within a year but that I continued privately relitigating in my mind for nearly 2 decades afterward. I told myself, for years, that holding onto these grudges was a form of self-respect. If I simply let them go, I believed, it would mean the wrongs done to me had not truly mattered, that I was somehow condoning what had happened by finally releasing my anger about it. This belief felt noble at the time. It felt like loyalty to my own sense of justice. But somewhere in my late 60s, a doctor's visit changed how I understood this habit entirely. My doctor, reviewing my persistently elevated blood pressure alongside my restless sleep, asked me a simple question that I could not answer honestly at first. He asked what I thought about most often when I could not fall asleep at night. And when I finally admitted the truth to myself, I realized it was rarely my grandchildren, rarely my wife, rarely the good things filling my days. It was, more often than I wanted to admit, old arguments I was still quietly refighting in the dark, decades after the people involved had likely forgotten them entirely. This was the moment I understood the true cost of this habit. The people I held grudges against were, in most cases, living perfectly untroubled lives, rarely thinking of me or the conflict at all. I was the only one still paying the toll for a debt that had, in truth, expired years earlier. Holding a grudge, I came to understand, is a bit like drinking a poison every night and expecting the other person to be the one who suffers from it. The resentment does not punish them. It simply keeps quietly poisoning you, one restless night at a time, while they go on living entirely unaware of the debt you believe they still owe you. Releasing this habit did not happen overnight, and it did not require pretending the original wrongs had never happened or did not matter. What it required was a slow, deliberate practice of asking myself, each time an old grudge surfaced, whether I wanted to keep paying this particular toll for one more night. Most nights, once I asked the question honestly, the answer was no. I began writing letters I never intended to send, simply to release the words from where they had been trapped for decades. I began, slowly, allowing myself to imagine the people who had wronged me as flawed, limited humans doing their imperfect best, rather than villains I needed to keep punishing in my mind forever. My blood pressure improved. My sleep improved. But more than either of these, something inside my chest that had been clenched tight for decades finally, slowly, began to loosen. I want to be honest that this release was not linear. There were setbacks, moments when an old resentment resurfaced with surprising force, triggered by something as small as a familiar name mentioned in passing or a photograph found while cleaning out a drawer. In these moments, I learned not to judge myself harshly for the resentment's return, but simply to notice it, acknowledge it briefly, and return once more to the question of whether I wished to keep carrying it. Over time, the moments of relapse grew further apart and shorter in duration, until eventually most of these old grudges had quietly lost their grip on me almost entirely, not through a single dramatic act of forgiveness, but through hundreds of small, repeated choices to finally set the weight back down. For most of my life, I was a master of postponement when it came to difficult conversations. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, a calmer week, a better mood, a more convenient holiday visit, a time when everyone would be less tired and more receptive. I postponed telling my father how much his approval had meant to me as a young man. I postponed telling an old friend that a comment he made decades earlier had hurt me more deeply than I ever let on. I postponed telling my own children certain truths about my health, about my finances, about fears I carried privately, believing there would always be more time to have these conversations properly, once conditions were finally ideal. The lesson that finally broke this habit arrived through loss, as these lessons so often do. My father passed rather suddenly in my early 60s, before I had ever managed to have the conversation I had been postponing for nearly 30 years. I stood at his graveside with an entire speech still trapped inside me, words I had rehearsed privately for decades but had never once spoken aloud to the person who most needed to hear them. I remember thinking, in that moment, that I had somehow believed time was an unlimited resource I could draw from whenever I finally felt ready, when in truth it had been quietly running out the entire time, without ever announcing itself clearly enough for me to notice. After this loss, I began to understand postponement differently. It is not a neutral pause, patiently waiting for a better moment to eventually arrive. It is, more often, a slow and comfortable form of avoidance, disguised as patience or thoughtfulness. The right moment we are waiting for rarely announces itself clearly. It usually has to be created deliberately, often while feeling somewhat uncomfortable and unprepared, rather than waited for passively until discomfort disappears entirely on its own. I began, in the years that followed, forcing myself to have conversations while they still felt slightly too early, slightly too raw, slightly too uncomfortable, rather than continuing to wait for a sense of readiness that I now understood might never fully arrive. I told my remaining brother things I had been meaning to say for years. I told my children the truth about my health concerns rather than protecting them from worry a little longer. I told an old friend, quite awkwardly over coffee, that a decades-old comment had wounded me, and to my surprise, he had no memory of it at all, and the conversation dissolved into an entirely unexpected, easy laughter rather than the tension I had feared for years. Not every postponed conversation I finally had unfolded so gently. Some were painful, some remained unresolved even after being spoken aloud. But every single one of them left me lighter than the silent postponement ever had, and none of them left me standing at a graveside with unspoken words still trapped uselessly inside my chest. I have since come to believe that the fear behind most postponed conversations is rarely a fear of the conversation itself. It is a fear of the brief discomfort required to begin it, a discomfort that almost always turns out to be far smaller and shorter-lived than the years of quiet weight carried by continuing to postpone it. I now keep, somewhere in the back of my mind, a short private list of conversations I have not yet had, and I try to review it honestly every few months, asking myself gently whether any of these particular silences have gone on long enough. It is a small practice, but it has kept me from ever again standing somewhere important with an entire unspoken speech still trapped uselessly inside me. For decades, my sense of value in the world was tightly, almost desperately, tied to how needed I appeared to others. I filled my calendar aggressively. I said yes to every request for help, every committee, every favor asked of me, because being busy and needed felt, at the time, like undeniable proof that my life still mattered. I quietly judged retired friends who seemed content with slower, quieter days, privately believing they had simply given up on contributing anything meaningful to the world around them. This habit revealed its true cost to me gradually, through a kind of exhaustion that crept in so slowly I almost did not notice it arriving. In my late 60s, I found myself resentful during activities I had once genuinely enjoyed, snapping impatiently at family members during moments that should have been peaceful, feeling a persistent, low-grade anxiety even during supposedly restful weekends. When I finally sat with this exhaustion honestly, rather than simply pushing through it as I always had before, I understood that I had built my entire sense of worth on a foundation that required constant, exhausting proof, one that could never actually be satisfied no matter how much I accomplished or how many people depended on me. The turning point came during a minor health scare that forced me, for the first time in decades, to cancel nearly every obligation on my calendar for almost 6 weeks. I expected, during this forced pause, to feel useless, invisible, quietly ashamed of contributing so little to those around me. Instead, something unexpected happened. My family did not love me any less during those 6 quiet weeks. My friendships did not weaken. The world, remarkably, continued turning entirely without my constant, frantic contribution to it. I began to understand, slowly and with some discomfort, that my worth had never actually depended on how busy or needed I appeared. It had been there all along, quietly waiting underneath all that frantic activity, for me to finally notice it without needing to earn it first. Releasing this habit meant learning to sit with quiet, unproductive afternoons without the familiar anxious voice insisting I was wasting valuable time. It meant learning to say no to requests I once would have accepted purely out of habit, freeing space for rest that no longer needed to be justified by exhaustion or illness first. It meant discovering, somewhat to my own surprise, that I actually enjoyed many quiet activities I had dismissed for years as things only unproductive people did: a slow walk with no particular destination, an entire afternoon spent reading purely for pleasure, a conversation with no particular agenda attached to it at all. I did not become less valuable to the people who loved me. I simply became more present with them, no longer perpetually distracted by the next obligation waiting to prove my worth all over again. I have noticed, watching other friends approach this same threshold, that this particular habit often disguises itself as simple generosity or reliability, making it especially difficult to recognize as a problem worth addressing. I want to be clear that genuine generosity, offered freely and without the desperate need for external proof of worth beneath it, remains one of the finest qualities a person can carry into old age. The distinction I eventually learned to notice within myself was a subtle but important one: whether I was saying yes from a place of genuine desire to help, or from a quiet panic that declining might reveal I had become, in some fundamental way, no longer needed. Once I learned to pause and honestly ask myself which of these two forces was actually driving a particular yes, I found I could remain just as generous as before, only now from a place of genuine choice rather than anxious obligation. I spent an enormous, largely invisible portion of my life quietly measuring my own progress against the progress of people around me. I compared my career achievements to my brothers. I compared the size of my retirement savings to my neighbors, gathered through careful, indirect questioning rather than any honest conversation. I compared my children's accomplishments to the accomplishments of my friends' children, and I compared my own health and vitality, with increasing anxiety as the years passed, to the health of every acquaintance my age I happened to encounter. This habit is a particularly cruel one, I eventually came to understand, because it offers no finish line at which the comparing can finally stop. There is always someone further ahead by whatever measure I happen to be using that week: more money, better health, more accomplished children, a more impressive career, a more peaceful retirement. And there is always someone further behind as well, though I noticed I rarely paused to comfort myself with this half of the comparison nearly as often as I tormented myself with the other. The habit, I finally understood, was never actually about accurately assessing my own life. It was a machine that manufactured a sense of inadequacy no matter what evidence I fed into it. The specific moment this habit finally cracked open for me arrived during a conversation with an old college friend, a man who by every external measure had achieved far more than I had: greater wealth, a more prestigious career, a beautiful vacation home I had quietly envied for years. Over dinner one evening in my late 60s, he confided in me, with surprising vulnerability, that he had spent decades secretly comparing his own more modest family closeness to the warmth he had always admired in my family, wishing his own children called him as often as mine called me. I sat there, stunned, realizing that this man I had spent 30 years quietly envying had, all along, been quietly envying something in my own life that I had barely noticed I possessed. This conversation taught me something I have never forgotten. Every single person I had ever compared myself against was almost certainly comparing themselves against someone else in turn, each of us standing in an endless chain of quiet envy, none of us actually seeing the full, complicated truth of what anyone else's life genuinely contained. I began, slowly, to practice noticing my own life on its own terms, without immediately placing it beside anyone else's for measurement. This did not happen instantly, and I still catch the old habit rising up occasionally, even now. But I no longer let it govern my sense of my own worth the way it once did, and the relief of stepping off that particular treadmill has been one of the most unexpected gifts of my later years. I have since found it helpful, whenever the old comparing instinct rises up in me, to ask myself a very specific question rather than simply trying to suppress the thought entirely. I ask myself what exact feeling I am hoping the comparison will finally deliver. Usually it is some version of reassurance that I have not wasted my life, that my choices were reasonable ones. Once I locate that underlying need honestly, I have found I can often address it directly, through gratitude or reflection on my own actual life, rather than through the indirect and ultimately unsatisfying route of measuring myself against someone else's very different journey. The reassurance I was seeking, I discovered, was never actually available through comparison in the first place. It had been waiting, quietly, inside my own life the entire time. For most of my life, I quietly waited for permission before allowing myself genuine enjoyment. I waited until the house was completely paid off before allowing myself a vacation. I waited until my children were fully independent before allowing myself hobbies that were purely for my own pleasure. I waited until I had accumulated enough savings, enough security, enough certainty about the future, believing that only once every possible worry had been fully resolved would I finally be permitted to simply enjoy being alive. The problem with this habit, which took me far too long to recognize, is that the conditions I was waiting for kept quietly shifting the moment I approached them. Once the house was paid off, a new financial concern appeared to take its place. Once my children became independent, new worries about their own struggles replaced my old worries about their dependence. There was never actually a finish line where every condition would finally be satisfied at once, permitting me, at last, to simply relax into enjoying my own life without reservation. I had built an elaborate obstacle course for my own happiness, and I kept adding new obstacles the moment I cleared the old ones. I finally understood the true cost of this habit while watching a close friend, only a few years older than myself, pass away rather suddenly just 18 months into what was meant to be a long, leisurely retirement he had delayed enjoying for decades while he finished preparing for it properly. He had, quite literally, purchased a small sailboat he had dreamed about since his 20s only months before his death, and it sat mostly unused in the harbour, a monument to a joy he had postponed permitting himself for nearly 50 years. I attended his funeral and drove home in a heavy, unfamiliar silence, finally asking myself honestly what exact conditions I myself was still quietly waiting to satisfy before I would allow my own joy to begin. I did not sell my house and buy a sailboat, though I understand why some people, hearing a story like this, might feel tempted toward such a dramatic gesture. What I did instead was smaller, and I believe more sustainable. I began permitting myself small pleasures immediately, without waiting for some larger condition to be satisfied first. I took a modest trip I had been postponing for 3 years, not because every financial concern had been resolved, but because I decided the joy mattered more than the imagined perfect conditions I had been waiting for. I picked up a hobby I had abandoned in my 30s simply because it brought me pleasure, not because it served any larger purpose or accomplishment. I learned, slowly, that joy does not actually require permission from a fully resolved life. It only requires a willingness to let it in now, imperfectly, alongside whatever uncertainties remain unresolved around it. What surprised me most in this practice was how quickly the old, familiar guilt tried to reassert itself each time I allowed myself a small pleasure ahead of schedule. A quiet voice would remind me that I had not yet fully earned this particular enjoyment, that responsible people waited until every obligation had been properly discharged first. I learned to notice this voice without obeying it, treating it the way I might treat an overcautious old friend whose advice, however well-intentioned, no longer actually served my genuine well-being. Slowly, with repeated practice, the voice grew quieter, and the joy I allowed myself began to feel less like a stolen indulgence and more like simply, finally, an ordinary part of being alive. The final habit I want to share with you today may be the deepest and most quietly damaging of them all. For most of my adult life, I believe that by a certain age, a person's identity should already be fully formed, finished, and settled, that continuing to genuinely change your mind, your beliefs, your habits, or your sense of self past a certain point was somehow a sign of instability rather than growth. I clung tightly to old opinions long after I privately suspected they no longer served me, simply because changing them felt like admitting my earlier self had been wrong, and admitting this felt, at the time, like a small kind of failure I was not prepared to accept. This habit cost me more than I realized for many years. I stayed loyal to old political opinions I had quietly outgrown, uncomfortable with the idea of my grandchildren watching me change my mind so late in life. I stayed loyal to old habits and routines long after they had stopped serving my genuine well-being, simply because they had become part of the story I told about who I was. I even stayed loyal, for far too long, to an old, narrow definition of what a man my age was supposed to be interested in, quietly dismissing new hobbies or curiosities that arose in me because they did not fit the finished picture I believed I was supposed to already represent. The habit finally began to loosen its grip during a conversation with my youngest grandchild, who asked me, with the innocent bluntness only a child can offer, whether I still believed everything I had believed when I was her father's age. I started to answer automatically, and then stopped myself, genuinely uncertain for a long moment. The honest answer, once I sat with it, was no. I had changed my mind about a great many things over the decades, quietly and mostly without acknowledging it even to myself, because acknowledging it felt like an admission I was not prepared to make out loud. That conversation became a quiet turning point. I began allowing myself, for the first time in decades, to say the words I used to believe differently out loud, without shame attached to them. I began exploring new interests in my 70s that had nothing to do with the identity I had spent decades building and defending, simply because they brought me genuine curiosity and pleasure in the present moment. I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that the people around me did not respect me less for this openness. If anything, my grandchildren seemed to find it easier to be honest with me about their own uncertainties, once they saw that their grandfather was still willing to admit his own. Identity, I finally understood in my 70s, was never actually meant to be a finished monument, standing fixed and unchanging for the remainder of a lifetime. It was always meant to remain a living, breathing thing, capable of growth for as long as a person remains alive to keep growing it. I think, in some ways, this habit was the hardest of the 6 for me to fully release, because letting it go required admitting that many earlier versions of myself had simply been wrong, or at least incomplete, about things I once held with great conviction. There is a particular kind of humility required to say this honestly, especially to people who have known you for decades and may have grown accustomed to a more fixed version of who you are. But I have come to believe this humility is not a diminishment of character. It is, in fact, one of the clearest signs of a mind still fully alive, still willing to keep learning for as long as breath remains to learn with. My friends, if you recognize even one of these 6 habits in your own life today, I want you to know that recognizing it is already the hardest and most important part of the work. I lived with every single one of these habits well into my 60s, and I want to be honest with you that releasing them was rarely comfortable and never instantaneous. Old grudges still occasionally whisper to me late at night. I still catch myself, on certain days, quietly comparing my life to someone else's before I remember to stop. Change, at any age, is rarely a single dramatic moment. It is far more often a slow, repeated practice of noticing an old pattern and choosing, gently and imperfectly, to respond differently this time than you did the last. I share all of this with you today because I believe deeply that 70 does not need to be the age where these habits finally calcify into permanent fixtures of who you are. It can instead become the age where you finally set them down, one at a time, with whatever years remain ahead of you feeling lighter and freer than the years that came before. I cannot promise you it will be easy. I can only promise you, from my own experience, that it is worth every uncomfortable moment the releasing requires. I often think of these 6 habits now as 6 separate weights I once carried on a single set of shoulders, each one seeming, at the time, far too essential to ever consider setting down. Grudges felt like justice. Postponement felt like patience. Constant busyness felt like purpose. Comparison felt like ambition. Waiting for permission felt like responsibility. And a fixed identity felt like stability. It took me most of a lifetime to see clearly that each of these was, underneath its respectable disguise, quietly costing me something far more valuable than whatever it claimed to be protecting. I do not say this to shame the younger man who carried these weights for so long. He was doing the best he understood how to do at the time, with the tools he had available to him. I say it simply so that you, watching this today, might set some of these same weights down a little sooner than I managed to. If you are watching this and you are not yet 70, consider yourself fortunate to be hearing this a little earlier than I did. Begin the practice now, gently, one small honest moment at a time. And if you are already past 70, as I now am myself, I want you to know most sincerely that it is genuinely not too late. I began releasing some of these very habits well into my own 70s, and the peace they brought me arrived just as fully as I believe it would have arrived 20 years earlier, simply a little later than I once wished it would. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope something I shared brings you the courage to set down whatever old habit has been quietly weighing on you, and the peace of knowing it is genuinely never too late to begin again. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Release what no longer serves you gently, without shame for having carried it so long. And remember that the person you are becoming is always still, right up until your very last breath, a work quietly and beautifully in progress. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. Stay honest, stay open, and remember, the habits we finally release often teach us more than the ones we manage to keep. Thank you for watching.